Today we're going to talk about classical period. This piece right here is Mozart's 40th Symphony. It demonstrates the characteristics of the classical period really well. So if you want to understand more about the classical period, that's a great place to analyze, to start really getting an idea of how the phrases work, of how things like sequences are used, how phrasing and melodies are written, how to get a balanced sound and a simple harmony and stuff like that. So what we're going to do, we're going to step through a bit of the characteristics of the Baroque period and how that changed when the classical period came in. So Baroque was, roughly 1600 to 1750. 1750 was when Bach died, and most of us kind of agree he was like the pinnacle of the Baroque period. And so after his death was kind of the start of the classical period, even though it did start a little earlier than that. So what do we mean by Baroque period? These are some examples of Baroque pieces. Have a listen. These pieces generally went on and on and on and on. Like, there was an occasional cadence where the piece settled, and then the next phrase would just go on, and until the very final chord, the music kind of didn't stop at all. It just chugged along. Now, you'll notice that in the Baroque period, often they used polyphonic textures, which means there are several melodies of equal value or equal importance happening at the same time. A simpler work like Bach's Air still had a lot of chord changes, so every half bar, the harmonies changed. So even in this calmer piece, you can hear that the harmonies do still change a lot. And one final example of Baroque is, let's pull up this one. This came from the textbook, Bowman and Terry's Oral Maths. A great textbook, great one for you guys to look at, and this text is from there as well. This one is a Vivaldi piece. Once again, kind of just goes on and on. Great, I love the music, but that's the style. There was a lot of kind of layering happening, with every layer being quite important. So after a section, the next one comes straight in. It basically doesn't finish. It's quite virtuosic though. So back in the Baroque period, they were trying to really solidify or set up standards for each instrument. So Vivaldi kind of really took the violin as far as it could. Bach took a lot of the keyboard instruments as far as it could and really, worked out certain sciences about that stuff. All right, let's move on. So the classical style is different to this because the melodies are simpler. I'll just get out my highlighter. I'd recommend remembering these couple of points. So simpler melodies. Mozart did a variation on things like Twinkle Twinkle, and that ternary form style kind of came about more in the classical period, developing short ideas using sequences. Balanced phrasing, that's a really big point of classical music, where often you have a 2-bar start followed by a 2-bar finish for a 4-bar melody. That's called antecedent consequent melodies or phrases, and antecedent means almost like a question. An idea which isn't resolved yet, and then a consequent happens after that, which resolves it. An example might be Beethoven's 9th Symphony, where the Ode to Joy tune in the 4th movement, where it goes, that's the first half, and it's kind of a question mark. The piece hasn't resolved yet. Second half starts similarly, and that's the consequent phrase. An example could be, as simple as this piece here. Mozart's 40th, where I'll just zoom it in a bit so you can see it if it chooses to load. Apologies for that. It's not exactly wanted to load. sorry about that. But that's an example. An antecedent, a question. Second half is based on that. The consequent is a sequence, a step down. And then the phrase kind of settles there. So that's an example of how melodies are designed, and often the cadences actually finish the section, which is kind of nice. You get breaths. They use arpeggios a lot. So a lot of examples where, you look at Beethoven's First Sonata where they start with an arpeggio. You look at Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, bum, ba-dum, ba-da-ba-ba-ba-bum, using arpeggios as a motif. They use that a lot. Simpler harmonies. So in the classical period, they more or less stuck to the 1, 2, 4, 5s, and 6s, whereas in the Baroque, they used a lot more dissonant chords. They used a lot of diminished chords. They kind of flowed from a dissonant chord to another, and it was much more complex. And chords changed a lot quicker as well, which made it quite hard to follow the harmonies. Whereas in the classical period, it was kind of settled down. They used a lot of the cadential 6/4s to finish off sections. And finally, it was generally lighter and a homophonic texture, which means there is a melody with accompaniment. I'll just write some important points here that you need to know. Homophonic is melody with accompaniment, whereas earlier, polyphony in the Baroque period is many layers, many equal layers of sounds. So often it was a couple of melodies happening at the same time, which made it sound much more complex. Okay, there were a few other things I wanted to go through, but let's move on. Now, the next bit is about the orchestra. Sorry, I'm just struggling to scroll through this. There we go. Now, in the classical era, they did use a bit more woodwinds, and things generally got a bit larger. So the orchestra got a bit bigger. The symphonies, they have a rounder sound. They also ditched the harpsichord, which was part of the continuo section in the Baroque, and so it had less of that clunky sound generated by the keyboard instruments, and a rounder sound generally. Cool. And so that's an intro to the classical period and its style, and I guess some reasons why it does sound a bit rounder, a bit more calm compared to the Baroque era. All right.